Hollywood, sunset, a city of illusions, where every house hides a screenplay, and every light casts a shadow, just past Beverly Hills. Tucked into 5 acres of whispering trees and wrought iron gates, stands a mansion, a Tudor Gothic relic with 29 rooms, a private zoo, and a cave-like pool that once steamed with secrets. They called it paradise. It had everything: models, moguls, millionaires. Every night, a new guest list. Every hallway, a performance. Laughter echoed through stone archways. Champagne flowed through fountains. Cameras flashed against silk and skin. But what was it? Really, a palace of pleasure, or a machine of control? Because while the world envied what happened upstairs, the truth was hiding somewhere else, behind the walls, under the water, inside the tapes. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you crave stories behind the facade, dark stories of power, illusion, and the price of beauty, like, subscribe, and comment which house we should expose next. Because this isn't just a mansion, this is the mirror America refused to look into. Before the robe, the empire, the cameras, there was a boy. Hugh Hefner was born in 1926 in Chicago, into a home of strict morals and colder affections. His mother, a devout Methodist, famously claimed she withheld hugs so he wouldn't become spoiled. There were rules, silence, cleanliness, but no warmth. And in that emotional vacuum, a lonely child began drawing comics, stories, fantasies, not of war or heroes, but of escape. He wasn't popular, he wasn't wealthy, but he had imagination and a longing that couldn't be named. By high school, he'd invented a character called Hef Suave, charming, desired, a cartoon of who he wished he could be. That cartoon would soon become real. After serving in World War II, he married Mildred Williams. She confessed, early in the marriage, that she had been unfaithful while he was deployed. The admission shattered him. Years later, he would cite it as the root of his lifelong obsession with control. So, in 1953, armed with a $600 loan from that same mother, he launched Playboy. The first issue, Marilyn Monroe on the cover. Nude inside, sold over 50,000 copies. But Hefner wasn't just selling sex. He was selling escape. The Playboy philosophy. He called it cocktails, jazz, literature, and liberated women. A universe where the awkward boy no longer existed. But even fantasies come with conditions. The man who preached freedom insisted on control. He dictated magazine layouts, selected every playmate, and later decided what women wore in his own home. His girlfriends weren't partners, they were cast members. Their lives revolved around his routine. Breakfast at 10 movie nights, at 8 club appearances on Wednesdays and Saturdays, always beside him, always in order. He wore the same red silk robe, ate the same meals, watched the same films on repeat: Casablanca, Citizen Kane, sometimes twice in a day. The mansion became less of a home, more of a controlled environment, a set, a world preserved in amber. But beneath the choreography was something more fragile. Hefner wasn't a predator in the classic sense. He was a boy who never stopped protecting his dream from disruption. He built walls around desire. He scripted intimacy. And every person inside his orbit played a role, whether they realized it or not. He claimed to love women. But the evidence suggests he needed them obedient, interchangeable, smiling. When one left, another stepped in, blonde, 20-something, quiet. The dream had to continue. The illusion could never break. And what about love? He married 3 times, had 4 children, but rarely let anyone too close. His most famous girlfriends were often part of a harem 7 at once during the 2000s. And when asked about monogamy, he said, "I tried it. It didn't work." But did it not work? Or was it incompatible with the fantasy The Mansion, bought in 1971 for $1.05 million, was the physical embodiment of everything he wanted to believe about himself. At 5.7 acres, it was one of the largest private residences in Los Angeles. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a world he could control. And yet, even there, surrounded by women and wealth and worship, Hefner often seemed alone. He sat in his robe, watching black and white movies, writing in leather-bound journals over 2,000 volumes in his lifetime, documenting every moment, every guest, every grievance, as if by recording it, he could make it real, as if by never letting go, he could keep the dream alive. But dreams that are held too tightly eventually suffocate. And the mansion, his greatest creation, would become the stage for both his triumph and his quiet unraveling. Because while the world believed in Hef the liberator, the lover, the legend, few ever truly knew Hugh. He could have bought anywhere. A penthouse in New York, a retreat in the desert. But in 1971, Hugh Hefner chose 10236 Charing Cross Road, a sprawling Gothic Tudor estate in Holmby Hills, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive enclaves. The price, $1.05 million, equivalent to over $7.5 million today. But it wasn't just a real estate decision. It was a statement. Holmby Hills was old money ground, silent gates, tree-lined drives, neighbors named Sinatra and Spielberg. It wasn't Beverly Hills flash, it was inherited elegance. And by buying into it, Hefner inserted himself into a world that had once rejected men like him. He wasn't born into blue blood. But now, he'd own a piece of their kingdom. The mansion itself had pedigree. Built in 1927 by Arthur Letts, Jr., son of the founder of the May department stores. The home had 29 rooms, a wine cellar, an oak-paneled library, and 5.7 acres of manicured grounds. Its stone facade and leaded glass windows echoed English nobility. Its bones whispered wealth. But Hefner didn't want whispers. He wanted a stage. So he began transforming the estate into something never before seen, a surreal blend of aristocratic fantasy and adult Disneyland. The most iconic addition, the Grotto, beneath an artificial cave formation, surrounded by waterfalls and warmed by hidden jets. The infamous Grotto pool was engineered to be eternally inviting day or night. Its construction cost tens of thousands of dollars at the time, over $250,000 adjusted for inflation. Lights glowed underwater. Soft music piped through speakers hidden in faux rock. No clocks, no sharp edges, no escape. It wasn't just architecture, it was seduction, rendered in tile and temperature. Outside, Hefner added a full zoo. Yes, legally licensed. Peacocks screamed from rooftops. Macaws perched near koi ponds. Spider monkeys swung across branches in custom enclosures. Flamingos waded near the tennis court. It was a place where exotic animals mingled with exotic guests, and neither felt entirely at home. The grounds expanded with every passing year. A private aviary, a full game house with pinball machines, air hockey, and a stocked bar. A theater with Dolby sound. A greenhouse. And then, the security system's cameras in every corner. Tunnels connecting buildings. A command center to monitor comings and goings. This was not just a residence. It was a controlled ecosystem. Inside, every room served a function in the larger fantasy. Bedrooms were assigned, hierarchies enforced. The master suite connected directly to Hefner's private quarters via secret hallways. Guests could visit, but only by invitation. Even the staff had separate circulation paths, designed to remain invisible. And the people who entered, they were filtered, screened. A guest list wasn't just exclusive, it was curated like an art exhibit. Blonde hair, youth, curves, silence. The mansion operated like a castle, and Hefner its benevolent king. Or so the story went. But what's a king without a kingdom watching? That's why proximity mattered. Holmby Hills was not just remote, it was symbolic. A man who built his empire on nude magazines and sexual liberation had forced himself into the heart of Hollywood's conservative elite. The joke was no longer on him, it was on everyone who ever said he didn't belong. But the irony, he didn't build a house to blend in. He built one to disappear into. Because behind the moats and monkeys and marble lies a different story of a man obsessed with control, and a home designed not just to impress others, but to keep them out. A fortress, a theater, a labyrinth, and at its center, a man who never wanted to leave. To the untrained eye, the Playboy Mansion was just another luxury estate. But to those who stepped inside, it became clear this wasn't a house, it was a production, and Hefner was the director. The transformation began immediately after the 1971 purchase. Teams of contractors, engineers, landscape architects, sound technicians, lighting designers, and animal handlers descended upon the property. The goal wasn't comfort, it was immersion. Step 1, the Grotto. More than a pool. The Grotto was engineered like a sensual trap, with a faux cave exterior and heated interiors. It was always the perfect temperature. Strategic lighting hid imperfections and flattered skin tones. Plush towels, lubricants, condoms, everything was provided. Every sound was calibrated, fountains covered awkward silence. Music softened inhibitions. The cost estimated at $250,000 in the 1970s, nearly $2 million today. But it wasn't just about water. Next came the game house. Vintage arcade machines, billiards, pinball, a bar with top-shelf liquor. The air was cool, filtered, scented with citrus. Cameras watched every corner, not for safety, but for archive. Hefner documented everything. Then, the zoo. By the 1980s, the estate had earned its exotic animal license. Flamingos strolled the gardens. Peacocks screamed from the rooftops. A capuchin monkey named Banana had free rein. At one point, the mansion housed over 100 animals kept not for conservation, but ambiance. Their presence blurred the line between natural and artificial, spectacle and reality. Every inch of the 5.7-acre property served a purpose in Hefner's erotic architecture. The mansion's bedrooms were themed mirror ceilings, rotating beds, shag carpet, leopard print upholstery, the Elvis room, the gym room, the blue room. Most guests didn't stay long enough to remember which was which, and those who did usually signed NDAs. Hefner's own suite was a compound within the compound, multiple rooms, an office, a personal kitchen, even a separate staircase. He lived there full-time, often emerging only for scheduled meals, movie nights, or club nights, his term for outings with his entourage to Hollywood's elite venues. Behind the walls, there were mazes, secret passageways, security offices, and at least one underground tunnel connecting the mansion to nearby guest homes. Some said the tunnels were for privacy. Others said they were escape routes. Every day, a small army kept the fantasy running. Dozens of staff housekeepers, chefs, gardeners, electricians. Animal care specialists worked in shifts. Some lived on site. Most were invisible. Their job wasn't just service. It was silence. Nothing could break the illusion. If something spilled, it vanished. If something broke, it was replaced. If something went wrong, it was edited out of memory. The cameras saw to that. Hefner was obsessed with documentation. Security footage ran 24/7. Parties were filmed. Encounters captured. There was a rumored archive vaults of tapes, stored on site. What was on them, no one really knows. Some say they were souvenirs, others, leverage. But even without the footage, the mansion functioned like a machine. Lights dimmed automatically after dusk. The temperature adjusted depending on the number of guests. Music playlists were curated hourly. Even scent was programmed floral by day, musky by night. Everything was calculated to lower resistance, to blur lines, to keep the party going. But not all illusions last forever. Maintenance costs soared, over $1 million per year by the late 2000s, just to keep the fantasy alive. Plumbing failed, tiles cracked. The Grotto, once sacred, became a biohazard. One guest in 2011 claimed, "That place looked sexy in photos. In real life, it smelled like mildew and chlorine." Another said, "It was like Disneyland, except the rides never got cleaned." And yet the guests kept coming, because the fantasy was stronger than the truth. But behind the laughter and lights, something else grew: exhaustion. Not just from the staff, but from the dream itself. Because once everything is scripted, when desire is prearranged, passion pre-approved, fun pre-manufactured, what's left? What happens to a house when it forgets it's a home? What happens to the man inside when he can't tell the difference between the fantasy and the prison? The parties were legendary. Halloween, Midsummer Night's Dream, New Year's Eve. Nights when the air itself seemed to shimmer. A-list celebrities arrived in black-tinted limos. Models spilled across velvet carpets. Waiters in bow ties passed silver trays of oysters and champagne. The mansion glowed with anticipation. But pleasure always casts a shadow. The guest list was carefully managed. Women were often selected in advance, invited based on looks, social ranking, and Hefner's personal taste. Entry wasn't just about fame, it was about utility. A +1 had to be attractive, agreeable, camera-ready. Wristbands were color-coded: red for inner circle, blue for general access, green for staff or press. A hierarchy in neon plastic. Inside, sex was never forced but rarely free. Holly Madison, former #1 girlfriend, later recalled in her memoir Down the Rabbit Hole that group sexual encounters were scheduled like appointments. "You could say no," she wrote, "but you also knew what that meant." Others described drinking before being escorted to Hefner's room. The encounters were often brief, silent, transactional. The Grotto was the most infamous scene. By the mid-2000s, it had become so unsanitary that regular guests joked about the Grotto rash, a skin infection reportedly spread from the water's poor hygiene. Doctors warned of STDs being transmittable in those conditions. Rumors of chlamydia outbreaks circulated in private. Towels were often reused. Condoms discarded. No one cleaned up until morning. There were incidents, overdoses, sexual injuries, fights. A woman once fell unconscious in the game house bathroom. Staff were told not to call an ambulance unless she couldn't be moved. Several lawsuits, mostly settled quietly. Alleged non-consensual filming, inappropriate touching, coercion. But the mansion's rules were clear. No phones, no photos, no records. And in the absence of evidence, silence reigned. The staff knew. They saw it all. They carried drunk women to guest rooms. They replaced bedding. They cleaned vomit from the tile floors before dawn. But speaking out meant blacklisting. Careers destroyed. One former butler later said, "We knew who was in danger, but it wasn't our place to act. We were told we were disposable." And while upstairs shimmered in candlelight, downstairs bore the weight. Housekeepers worked in pairs, one to clean, one to keep watch. Sexual paraphernalia was catalogued and removed. Soiled linens had their own laundry route. The Grotto alone required 3 hours of scrubbing after each party. Chemical burns were not uncommon. The mansion kept operating like a dream factory, but the reality beneath grew heavy. Some women left with careers, others left with trauma. Few spoke publicly until Hefner died in 2017. Then, the flood began. Podcast confessions, memoirs, leaked NDAs, stories that aligned in eerie, echoing details. And what about the men Bill Cosby? Now a convicted sex offender was a frequent guest. At least one alleged assault occurred inside the mansion. Others likely did too. Hefner distanced himself. But the implication remained: this house offered cover. For power. For silence. For secrets. What looked like a party was often a transaction. And for every photograph of a smiling playmate, there were 10 moments unseen: a door closed too hard, a drink pushed too far, a woman crying in a mirrored bathroom, wondering how she got there. The media never showed that. Because the myth was more profitable. Because fantasies don't have dirty floors. But while the guests danced upstairs, someone downstairs was paying the real price. They were called playmates, girlfriends, bunnies, angels. But beneath the labels, they were women recruited, remodeled, arranged. Hefner insisted he was empowering them. He gave them fame, housing, $1,000 a week allowance, even breast implants covered by the mansion health plan. They got parties, magazine spreads, club access, and the illusion of agency. But it came with conditions. To live in the mansion meant obeying the rules. Curfew was 9 p.m. unless you were attending a club with Hef. Weekly fun in the sun pool parties were mandatory. Group sex, expected. No red lipstick, no dark nail polish, no deviation from the blonde, bronzed, and compliant aesthetic. No independence. Holly Madison described life inside as a golden cage. Girls weren't allowed to have outside jobs, boyfriends, or even unapproved phone calls. Their closets were monitored. If they gained weight, they were shamed. If they tried to leave, they were isolated. And inside that controlled beauty, psychological cracks formed. Eating disorders were rampant. Laxatives passed like candy. Women compared calories, hid meals, competed silently for attention. Being the main girlfriend meant being the most obedient, the most available, the most invisible to yourself. And the trauma didn't end at the gates. After leaving, many former playmates struggled with identity collapse. They had built their lives on being desired. But what happens when that desire fades? Some turn to drugs, others to therapy. One overdosed, another attempted suicide. Others simply disappeared. They were iconic, but not immortal. There was no safety net, no pension, no post-Playboy career plan. Their value had been their youth. And youth, in the mansion, expired quickly. Some women sued. Others spoke out. But most stayed silent for fear of being mocked, disbelieved, erased. And what about the ones who never made it into the magazines, the party girls, the nameless models, the aspiring actresses flown in, photographed, promised a chance, then discarded? Their stories were never printed, their pain never archived. And then there were the tapes. Hefner documented everything, from casual encounters to private conversations. Many events were filmed, sometimes without full consent. One former employee claimed he kept a vault of hundreds of videotapes, labeled by date, color-coded by category, blackmail, insurance, or just obsession. No one knows, but the implication was clear: the women inside were beautiful, desired, and replaceable. And yet millions envied them, because the fantasy was that strong. They were smiling in the photos, weren't they? They were laughing at the parties, they looked free. But the truth is, being watched is not the same as being seen. Being wanted is not the same as being loved. And being invited into the mansion was not the same as belonging. The world only saw the glossy magazine covers, not the diaries, not the therapy bills, not the silence. Because while the lights were always on in the Playboy Mansion, no one ever asked what it was like to live in the dark. To run a fantasy, you need an army. And the Playboy Mansion, while marketed as effortless pleasure, was a non-stop logistical ballet operating behind the scenes. 24 hours a day, at its peak, The mansion employed over 70 people. There were butlers in white gloves, housekeepers in uniform, groundskeepers who tended to the zoo, and animal handlers responsible for monkeys, parrots, and peacocks. A full-time chef worked from the private kitchen adjoining Hefner's quarters, preparing meals according to his strict rotation: scrambled eggs and sausage for breakfast, soup and crackers for lunch, fried chicken or roast beef for dinner, every day, every meal, every time. Most of the staff worked in silence. That was part of the job. Cleaners entered rooms only when summoned. They were trained to replace without disturbing, to sanitize without observing, to vanish before being noticed. Linens were changed daily, towels twice a day. Bedding from the grotto required bleaching, disinfection, and often disposal. One staffer once told a documentary crew, "We went through sheets the way other people go through napkins." Security operated like a small private military. Cameras were mounted in every hallway. A central command post inside the mansion tracked all movement: who entered, who left, and who stayed too long. Visitors were logged, guests were scanned, tapes were archived. Rumors of secret passageways, tunnels linking the mansion to neighboring properties weren't just tabloid fantasies. They were real, part of a larger infrastructure designed to ensure discretion. Celebrities, politicians, moguls, they needed exits that avoided cameras. Hefner himself rarely left. His universe was perfectly curated within these walls. He held meetings in silk pajamas. He watched films in a personal theater with Dolby surround. He made calls on a red rotary phone while writing in custom-bound journals that documented, in obsessive detail, the daily happenings inside his kingdom. Over 2,000 volumes by the time of his death. To maintain the illusion of spontaneity, everything had to be planned. Pool temperatures were monitored hourly. Outdoor music rotated on a pre-approved schedule. Lighting inside the grotto adjusted automatically depending on time of day and number of guests. Even the scent was curated: floral in the mornings, musky by night. And then there were the staff rules: no fraternization, no eye contact with guests unless spoken to, no discussing internal matters outside the gates. Many were made to sign confidentiality agreements. One former cleaner recalled being terminated for simply acknowledging a Playmate's birthday without clearance. But despite the structure, cracks appeared. Burnout was common. Turnover, high. Pay varied from generous salaries for senior staff to minimum wage for entry-level workers. Most did not receive health benefits. Some slept on site in cramped quarters above the garage. One former employee claimed she worked 18-hour shifts without overtime, cleaning, restocking, prepping for the next performance. There were accidents. One electrician fell from a ladder and broke his spine. Another worker was bitten by a monkey while cleaning its cage. No insurance coverage followed. These stories rarely made it out. The mansion protected itself. It had to, because the guests weren't supposed to see the gears. They were only supposed to see the glow. And the staff, exhausted, invisible. Essential became the hands behind the curtain. When asked years later if they regretted their time there, some staff said no. They were proud to have worked in such an iconic place. Others paused, then answered carefully. "It was magic," one said, "but not for us." Because while the guests danced upstairs, someone downstairs was scrubbing blood from velvet cushions. The mansion was the crown, but Playboy, the empire. And in the second half of the 20th century, there was no magazine more divisive, more iconic, more profitable than Hugh Hefner's monthly Doctrine of Sex, Lifestyle, and Rebellion. Launched in 1953 with Marilyn Monroe's stolen nude photos as its first cover feature. Playboy didn't just sell images, it sold aspiration. It told men what to wear, what to drink, what to read, who to become. In its prime, the magazine reached a circulation of over 7 million copies a month. It was translated into over 20 languages. Its logo, an arched eyebrow rabbit in a tuxedo bow tie, was as recognizable as Coca-Cola's ribbon. Playboy was more than print. It was a belief system. one that centered around a very specific kind of masculinity urbane, well-read, sensual, and always in control. Hefner called it the Playboy philosophy. It wasn't just about sex, it was about status. He positioned his readers as intellectual libertines, men who appreciated jazz, art, literature, and female nudity as part of the same refined appetite. The magazine published interviews with Fidel Castro, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. It gave first platforms to writers like Hunter S. Thompson, Margaret Atwood, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But no matter how thoughtful the articles, the centerfold remained the altar, a monthly goddess, lit and posed to fulfill the dream. And each playmate wasn't just a body. She was part of the canon. She had a month, a name, a favorite movie. And then she disappeared, replaced by another. The brand exploded. Playboy clubs opened in cities across the world, with bunnies serving cocktails in satin corsets and perky ears. At its peak in the 1970s, there were more than 40 clubs and resorts, generating hundreds of millions in revenue. The mansion itself became the set piece, the Holy of Holies. Celebrities flocked to it. Politicians circled it. Athletes, movie stars. Even royalty showed up for a taste of the dream. And as the cameras flashed and the girls posed, the myth grew. But beneath the champagne gloss, Playboy was running on an unsustainable contradiction. It wanted to be art and pornography, feminist and patriarchal, rebellious and respectable. It wanted to be all things to all people, but never questioned who was truly in charge. Hefner controlled everything from cover selections to interview edits. His voice was the brand's voice, his dream, the brand's promise. And that dream never aged. Even as culture evolved, even as feminism matured and sexual politics became more nuanced, Playboy stood still glossy, still white, still male, and slowly, the empire cracked, circulation fell, competitors emerged. The internet eroded exclusivity. By the 2000s, Playboy was no longer dangerous, it was nostalgic. The mansion became a reality show set. Hefner, a kind of museum piece. His girlfriends, interchangeable characters in a strange domestic soap opera. And yet, the brand endured like a relic with just enough sparkle to draw in tourists. Not because it was still relevant, but because it was so defiantly frozen in time. But what kind of God builds a religion around himself and then lives long enough to watch the congregation leave? And when the sermons are just photos and the followers are fading, what's left? A logo, a memory, and a mansion full of silence. Every empire declines, but not every empire decays in public. The Playboy Mansion, once a shining monument to rebellion and desire, became in its later years something closer to a museum of delusion. The paint peeled, the carpet stained, the chandeliers still shimmered, but beneath them, the air was heavy, not with perfume, but with memory. By the 2010s, the dream was dying. It wasn't one scandal, it was 1,000 cuts. Former girlfriends began to speak. Holly Madison's memoir shattered the facade. She described not just boredom, but depression, control, surveillance. "I didn't feel loved," she wrote. "I felt watched." Kendra Wilkinson. Bridget Marquardt, names once synonymous with carefree beauty, began revealing how structured, even punitive. Life in the mansion had become, girls were pit against each other. Physical affection with Hef was expected on club nights. Every exit was seen as betrayal. But the most devastating stories came not from those who dated Hefner, but those who were simply present. In 2014, accusations resurfaced against Bill Cosby, longtime friend and frequent mansion guest. At least one woman alleged she was drugged and assaulted by Cosby inside the mansion itself. The scandal exploded. More women came forward, and while Hefner denied direct involvement, the atmosphere of silent complicity was undeniable. The mansion had become a stage for power to hide. There were other allegations. Underage girls at parties, drug use, hidden cameras. One former employee claimed there were rooms no one was allowed to clean, vaults where tapes were kept. Some labeled, some not. Legal teams moved quickly. Settlements paid. But the damage lingered. Outside, the world was changing. Feminism had entered a fourth wave. Consent became a cultural flashpoint. Porn became free and digital. The idea of a man in pajamas directing women's sexuality felt not just outdated, but obscene. And the house, this once glittering paradise, started to rot. Guests described mildew in the grotto, cockroaches in the game house, broken jacuzzi pumps, a plumbing system that failed so frequently that engineers were hired full-time. One model described the mansion in its final years as haunted, but not by ghosts, by expectations that had died. The parties grew smaller, the girls younger. The Hefner of legend became the Hefner of awkward reality shows, mumbling, barely mobile, surrounded by women who looked more like nurses than lovers. And then came the real reckoning. After Hefner's death in 2017, the accounts multiplied. Stories long buried under NDAs surfaced in documentaries like Secrets of Playboy, Staff, Girlfriends. Friends, they spoke of manipulation, emotional abuse, and a man who built an empire by scripting every second of his world. One woman described waking up in the grotto unsure how she got there. Another remembered being filmed without permission. Another said she was offered drugs to loosen up. The dream had become a cautionary tale, but the real tragedy. No one inside was surprised, because they had lived the script, and when the spotlight dimmed, and the magazine shrunk to a novelty brand, and the parties stopped altogether, all that remained was the silence between truths. The mansion, sold in 2016 for $100 million, would never host another ball. Its buyer, billionaire Darren Metropolis, promised to preserve its structure but not its soul. The grotto would be drained, the zoo dismantled, the tapes unknown. And so ended the myth, not with fire, but with mildew, for all its glamour. The Playboy Mansion stood perilously close to collapse more than once, because beneath the satin sheets and silver trays, there was always a money problem, not in the early years. During the 1960s and 70s, Playboy was a juggernaut. The magazine's circulation soared. Clubs generated millions. Licensing deals from lighters to cologne brought in easy cash. But success breeds expansion, and expansion invites debt. By the 1980s, Playboy Enterprises was hemorrhaging money. Competition from Hustler and Penthouse undercut their dominance. Conservative backlash targeted advertisers, and internal mismanagement bled the brand dry. In 1982, Playboy lost $51 million. Hefner's daughter, Christy, took over as CEO and began drastic cost-cutting. Clubs were closed, staff laid off, and assets sold. The company survived, but barely. The mansion, though privately owned by Hefner, became a financial liability. Parties continued, but the maintenance bills ballooned. By the late 2000s, the cost of operating the estate exceeded $1 million per year. The zoo alone required 2 full-time animal caretakers. Security ran 24/7. Plumbing, dating back to 1927, failed regularly. The grotto leaked, mold spread in the wine cellar, and then came the lawsuits. In 2008, a former Playmate sued for breach of privacy, alleging she had been filmed without consent. Others followed. Legal fees mounted. Out-of-court settlements drained reserves. The magazine's relevance plummeted. By 2015, circulation had dropped below 800,000, a fraction of its peak. Digital content outpaced print. Free pornography made Playboy's nude spreads seem tame. Hefner's refusal to modernize only accelerated the decline. The company was no longer a titan, it was a relic. That same year, Playboy Enterprises announced it would stop printing nude images. The non-nude Playboy experiment was short-lived, but it marked a turning point. Investors were gone, advertisers too. The Mansion, once the brand's beating heart, became its anchor, a decaying symbol of an outdated dream. In 2016, the decision was made the house would be sold. But with one strange clause, Hefner would remain a resident until his death. The buyer, billionaire food magnate Darren Metropolis, agreed. He paid $100 million, twice the highest recorded home sale in the neighborhood. But the price wasn't for the bricks. It was for the myth. Hefner died the following year. And just like that, the lease expired. There had been earlier close calls. In the 1990s, tax audits threatened liquidation. In 2001, the collapse of .com advertisers nearly shuttered the magazine. After 9/11, travel restrictions hurt international club revenues, but somehow, each time, the house survived. Until it didn't. The real tragedy. The collapse wasn't dramatic. There was no fire, no raid, no rebellion. Just rot. Slow. Inevitable. And when the last staffer clocked out, when the last playmate drove away, and the last light in the grotto was switched off, the mansion didn't scream. It exhaled, as if it, too, had grown tired of pretending. Because even a fantasy, if stretched too long, begins to sag under its own weight. And even a king, if he lives long enough, must sell the throne. The Playboy Mansion was marketed as a dream, but whose dream was it? For those who watched from the outside, it represented liberation sex without shame, beauty without apology, pleasure without price. But from the inside, the illusion unraveled. Because the mansion, like so many symbols of opulence, operated on an unspoken truth. Its extravagance was built on the labor of others. There were maids who started shifts at 4 a.m., scrubbing the marble floors before guests awoke. Security guards who rotated in 12-hour shifts, eyes always open, mouths always shut. Animal caretakers who fed exotic species, swept droppings from tile, treated infections, and yet earned barely more than minimum wage. The women, they were glorified as liberated icons, but were contractually and socially caged. Their value was in their youth, silence, and symmetry. When they aged, gained weight, spoke up, or simply questioned the script, they were replaced. No warning, no severance, no legacy. No, Hefner would often say, it's not a prison. They can leave whenever they want. But what kind of freedom exists when leaving means being erased? The guests stratified by fame. A-list actors entered through the front gate. Newcomers waited in line. There was no democracy in desire. Everything had a code: who sat where, who danced when, who spoke to whom. Women were rated, ranked, rotated. Staff were invisible until they made a mistake. In a house obsessed with fantasy, reality became disposable. Even the architecture reinforced the divide. Upstairs, chandeliers, fur, champagne. Downstairs, utility rooms, laundry chutes, surveillance monitors. The mansion had no servants' wing, but it didn't need one. The entire layout was designed so those who cleaned, fed, guarded, and repaired the dream would never interrupt the guests living it. It was a class system disguised as a party, and like all class systems, it worked best when no one acknowledged it. The mansion's existence was predicated on aspiration. Everyone there, staff, playmates, even celebrities, were chasing proximity to power, to Hefner, to fame, to legacy. But aspiration can be a prison when it's built on rules you didn't write. And for many, The closer they got to the top floor, the more invisible they became. Playboy's brand claimed to celebrate the empowered modern man. But what kind of man needs everyone around him to remain voiceless, compliant, replaceable? What kind of empire punishes age, rewards silence, and demands aesthetic uniformity as the price of entry? The American dream says if you work hard enough, you can have it all. But inside the mansion, it became clear some were born into pleasure, while others labored to sustain it. Some were allowed to dream. Others were there to make those dreams feel real. And the greatest trick, it didn't feel like exploitation. It felt like aspiration. Until you woke up. Because while the parties were open to all, the power was reserved for one. Hugh Hefner died on September 27, 2017, in the very bedroom where he had lived and orchestrated his dream for nearly half a century. The official cause, natural. The symbolic cause, exhaustion. He was 91 years old, nearly blind, frail, confined to bed for much of his final year. The man who once commanded rooms filled with starlets and executives now received visitors in hushed, scheduled intervals. The silk pajamas remained. So did the slippers. But the aura had dimmed. Outside, a culture had changed. The Me Too movement exploded just weeks after his death. Suddenly, the stories whispered in corners and buried under NDAs became part of a global reckoning. Feminism wasn't just back, it had a megaphone. And with that volume came a re-examination of everything Hefner had built. Was he a liberator or a jailer, a visionary or a manipulator? The mansion, once buzzing with lights and life, fell silent. Darren Metropolis, the billionaire who bought the property for $100 million, began restoration plans, but not of parties of architecture. The Playboy insignia was removed, the grotto drained, the animals relocated. The house would be preserved structurally but purged spiritually. No more cameras, no more centerfolds, no more silk robes. The brand tried to evolve. Playboy magazine relaunched in digital formats. It hired new editors, introduced gender diversity, embraced progressive messaging. But the name carried too much baggage. Advertisers hesitated. Readers dwindled. The rabbit logo no longer promised sophistication, it signaled a relic. And so, an empire collapsed without ceremony. The last playmate. The last party. The last robe. Gone. In his final years. Hefner still believed in the dream. He surrounded himself with framed covers, video archives, awards. But those who saw him up close reported something else: sadness, loneliness. A man frozen in the image of who he once was, trapped in the house that had made him myth. He was buried next to Marilyn Monroe in a crypt he had purchased decades earlier for $75,000. The woman whose nude photo built his empire, immortalized beside the man who profited from it. They had never met. The symmetry was chilling. And so ends the story of a man who built a kingdom from desire and a house that turned into a mirror, not of pleasure, but of America. Because the Playboy Mansion wasn't just Hefner's dream, it was ours. Our obsession with beauty, our worship of fame, our willingness to confuse freedom with power. But dreams, no matter how seductive, must eventually end. And when they do, what remains? Just a house, empty rooms, and the echo of laughter that never quite reached the soul. Long after the chandeliers stopped glimmering and the grotto ran dry, the Playboy Mansion continued to exist not as a physical space, but as a cultural phantom, a myth still breathing through screens, lyrics, and nostalgia. It didn't vanish. It evolved. For decades, the mansion had served as the visual metonym for power, pleasure, and masculine aspiration. It was not just a house. It was a symbol, replicated endlessly in music videos, sitcoms, stand-up routines, and teenage dreams. When MTV Cribs aired, Rappers boasted that their homes were just like Hef's. When artists bragged about success, they referenced the mansion, not yachts, not private jets, but that house on Charing Cross Road, as if to say, this is the pinnacle. And even after Playboy's cultural relevance waned, the mansion remained frozen in time, still glowing in the rearview mirror of collective imagination. The rabbit logo itself, simple, elegant, ambiguous, became one of the most powerful branding tools in 20th century history. It adorned belts, cufflinks, perfume bottles, shot glasses, and nightclub walls. In Japan, it became a fashion statement. In Eastern Europe, it was mistaken for a luxury brand. By the 2000s, teenagers wore Playboy tracksuits without ever having opened the magazine. The image was sanitized, repackaged, mass-produced. And that, perhaps, is the darkest twist of all. What began as an adult rebellion against post-war sexual repression ended as pink glitter on a 13-year-old's bedroom door. The mansion's soul was built on transgression, but its afterlife commercial innocence. Yet, despite the trivialization, the influence runs deeper. Social media influencers now stage their lives in filtered simulacra of Hefner's dream-curated interiors, staged luxury, branded identities, algorithmically perfected selfhood. The grotto has been replaced by the rooftop infinity pool, the centerfold by the Instagram carousel, the mansion's architecture of control where appearance, power, and desirability were tightly regulated now exists across thousands of platforms. Today's creator houses in Los Angeles, Dubai, and Bali are descendants of that original fantasy factory. The difference: the camera is now handheld, the edits self-directed, the illusion crowdsourced. Hugh Hefner was, in many ways, the proto-influencer. He turned his home into a set, his lifestyle into a brand, and his relationships into serialized content. Long before YouTube couples vlogged their love lives, Hef was scripting his girlfriend hierarchy for public consumption. Long before TikTok stars monetized identity, Hefner commodified every aspect of his existence, from the slippers to the silk pajamas to the girls who walked beside him. He lived inside a feedback loop of fantasy, reinforcing a brand he could no longer separate from himself. But legacies are rarely one thing. Hefner gave platforms to writers no one else would touch. He published Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. He paid top dollar for interviews with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He pushed boundaries of censorship in an era where simply showing a woman's body was considered criminal. The contradiction was always part of the Playboy machine: highbrow meets lowbrow, intellect meets indulgence, progressivism meets patriarchy. And because of that complexity, the mansion's legacy cannot be dismissed with a hashtag or sealed behind scandal. It became a mirror for society's contradictions. We loved the fantasy, but scorned the architect. We praised the openness, but ignored the exploitation. We consumed the brand, but punished those who lived inside it. And that duality is what gives the mansion its enduring power. It was never real, but it revealed something true. In popular media, the mansion continues to surface. It appears in period films, retro documentaries, ironic fashion revivals. It has become both parody and pilgrimage. Celebrities who never visited still reference it. Historians who critique it still use its imagery. Even the scandals, Cosby, Me Too, trauma memoirs haven't erased the structure. If anything, they've solidified it as a cautionary tale of what happens when pleasure is confused with power, and when freedom is granted only to those who control the narrative. And what about the women? Some reclaimed their stories. Holly Madison's best-selling book became a Hulu docuseries. Bridget Marquardt started a podcast exploring paranormal themes, including claims the mansion is haunted. Others faded from public view, but their visibility now matters. The narrative no longer belongs solely to Hefner. The archive is open. The dream has cracks. Still, the cultural residue remains. In every photo shoot that uses faux fur and mirrored walls, in every brand promising exclusive access, in every mansion where the lights stay on all night. But no one sleeps peacefully. The Playboy Mansion no longer hosts parties. The tiles are dry. The cameras are unplugged. But its ghost lingers, not in Beverly Hills, but in the architecture of modern aspiration. It taught us how to curate a lifestyle, how to build desire, how to sell an illusion and make it feel like a revolution. And that, perhaps, is the legacy that will never die. Because long after the walls crumble and the archives are sealed, we are still living in a world it helped imagine. There was a time when the rich flaunted their wealth in brick and stone, Newport mansions with 40 bathrooms, French chateaux in the hills of Malibu, castles imported piece by piece from Europe. The Playboy Mansion stood proudly in that lineage, ornate, excessive, visible. But today, the billionaires are quiet. The new elite doesn't build mansions like this anymore. They build bunkers, compounds, floating islands. Why? Because the rules have changed. In the era of scrutiny, visibility is risk. Taxes, protesters, paparazzi wealth can no longer hide behind charm. Back then, opulence was a performance. Now it's a liability. You don't host lavish parties. You lease a server farm in the desert. You don't invite hundreds of strangers into your home. You encrypt your guest list. Jeff Bezos doesn't live in a castle, he builds a $500 million yacht with a shadow support vessel. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't throw Grotto parties, he buys up 500 acres in Hawaii, builds underground tunnels, and sues locals for access. Epstein didn't build a mansion. He built an island, far from oversight, where silence could be bought and truth buried. These are not houses of celebration. They are houses of defense. Because the dream has shifted. The new gods of wealth don't want to be adored. They want to be unseen. They understand what Hefner didn't, that fame is fragile, that power, in the open, eventually invites reckoning. That visibility means exposure, and exposure means consequence. In a surveillance society, the truly powerful don't leave footprints. They leave proxies, LLCs, shell companies, trusts. The Playboy Mansion was built for attention. It was a brand statement, a magnet. That model doesn't work anymore. Attention now brings lawsuits, hashtags, think pieces. What used to be aspiration is now ammunition. There's also the shift in desire. Hefner's empire was rooted in a mid-century American fantasy, women as decoration, leisure as lifestyle, status as seduction. But today's billionaires don't need sex to assert power. They have data. They have control. The mansion promised physical access. The new elite builds digital ones platforms, algorithms, invisible influence that shapes millions without ever inviting them inside. Why throw a party when you can shape what the world sees on their feed? And then there's legacy. Hefner believed he would be remembered, immortalized through ink and architecture. But modern billionaires don't care about monuments. They want exit strategies, citizenship in 6 countries, assets across jurisdictions. They don't want to be loved. They want to be untouchable. The old world celebrated visibility. The new one fears it. And yet there's irony. For all their secrecy, all their fortresses and firewalls, the legacy of the Playboy Mansion still echoes. It reminds us of a different kind of wealth. One that wanted to be known. One that built something concrete, however flawed, however toxic. A house where desire wore a face, and power answered the door in silk. The billionaires don't build like this anymore. Not because they can't, but because they've learned walls aren't enough. To truly hold power today, you must become invisible. The Playboy Mansion was built of stone, wood, and myth. But today's castles are made of pixels. Once, to enter a world of fantasy, you needed an invitation. Now, you just need a screen. And while the gates of Holmby Hills have rusted shut, a billion new ones have opened on OnlyFans, Instagram, Twitch, private Discord servers. The mansion is gone. But the architecture of desire has multiplied. In the digital age, anyone can be a playmate, a mogul, a voyeur. The velvet ropes have disappeared, but the rules remain. Platforms have replaced parlors. DMs replaced marble staircases. Subscribers replaced guests. And instead of butlers, we now have algorithms tireless, invisible, always optimizing. The Grotto, once a steamy underground cave of champagne and secrets, is now a virtual room where intimacy is sold in tokens and emojis. Control hasn't disappeared, it's just changed hands. The digital mansion is seductive. It promises freedom. No more gatekeepers, no more curfews, no more silk-robed patriarchs deciding who belongs. But here's the twist. Many of the same dynamics still apply. Youth is still currency. Beauty still defines reach. The female body is still the central commodity. And though the walls are invisible, they are no less real. Because the cost is still there, only now. It's paid in different coin. Creators grind endlessly for relevance, producing content around the clock, managing parasocial relationships with thousands of strangers. The pressure to perform doesn't end when the party does. There is no backstage, no real exit. Algorithms favor constant presence, disappear, and the spotlight vanishes. Say the wrong thing, and the mob arrives. The prison now has Wi-Fi and a follower count, but the promise lingers. Digital castles are everywhere. They don't need staff. They don't require maintenance. They don't crack tiles or flood their basements. They live in the cloud, accessible, seductive, scalable. A new kind of empire, borderless, nameless, frictionless. And what of the viewers? They scroll through virtual halls, peeking into bedrooms, watching performances tailored just for them. The illusion of access is stronger than ever. You don't need an invitation. You don't need status. For a few dollars or a click, you're inside. Not physically, but emotionally. Not permanently, but often enough to forget you were never really there. And in this new world, there is no Hefner, no central figure orchestrating the fantasy. Instead, there are thousands of smaller fiefdoms, each influencer a tiny monarch, each subscriber a paying subject. But the hierarchy persists. Those with reach control visibility, those with money dictate tone. The dream is more decentralized, but not necessarily more free. The Playboy Mansion is gone, but its logic, its structure survives in code, in platforms, in metrics, in... The architecture of seduction has become modular, mobile, and monetized. We no longer build castles with stone, we build them with content. And just like before, they dazzle, they invite, they promise something transcendent. But every digital mansion still has locked doors, still has a room you're not allowed to see, still has a cost. And just like the Grotto, there are things in the shadows we pretend not to notice. Because in the digital age, the dream didn't die. It simply updated its terms of service. The Playboy Mansion is silent now. The Grotto is dry. The zoo is gone. The gates, once a portal to power and pleasure, are rusted shut. But its story doesn't end with the real estate. It lives on in images, in language, in the invisible architecture of aspiration. We didn't just watch the dream. We believed in it. And that belief came with a price. For the women who walked its halls, the cost was identity. For the staff, it was invisibility. For the culture, it was decades of confusing liberation with performance, rebellion with branding, freedom with obedience. The mansion was never just a house. It was a factory of illusion, a stage for America's deepest contradictions. Pleasure built on labor, fame built on silence, fantasy built on surveillance. And like all dreams manufactured at scale, it demanded sacrifices no one wanted to admit. But now, the curtain is drawn, the players have left, and we are left with questions. What do we do with the legacy of a house that promised freedom but delivered control? What do we learn from a man who called himself a revolutionary but surrounded himself with obedience? What happens when a society builds an altar to beauty and then watches those who stood upon it fall? Maybe the mansion was a mirror. Maybe it reflected not just Hefner, but all of us, the way we chase perfection, consume power, rewrite memory to suit desire. Maybe that's why it still haunts us. Because even though the party ended, we never truly left. And now, in an age where every phone is a stage, every profile a curated identity, and every follower a witness, we are all building mansions. The question is, do we know the cost? If you've made it this far, thank you. If these walls could talk, maybe they just did. If you believe more people should question the architecture of desire, hit like. If you believe more of these stories should be told, subscribe. And if you know another house, another paradise built on silence, tell us below. Because behind every mansion, there is always a shadow.